Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And on this podcast, we gather together with friends who follow Jesus to make sense of this world. And today, we don't have just any friend, we have founding friend, David French. David, welcome back. The country has founding fathers, Good Faith has founding friends. So welcome back.
It's so great to be back. I love that title, Founding Friend, because on Advisory Opinions, Sarah has much less flattering descriptions of me. So
I'm all about it. I'm here to flatter you, David. I'm here for that.
I appreciate Founding Friend. That sounds lofty. I like that.
All right. Well, today my discussion with David is going to be on a weighty topic, and it's about war. I'm not talking about war in the cultural war, hyperbole sense of that word. I'm talking about actual war, like violent military conflict between organized armies. And the reason why this topic got catalyzed was because David and I were at the CCCU conference a few weeks ago, where we had that really fun live podcast that many of you probably have heard. And we were just kind of chilling out afterwards over drinks with some other folks. And the conversation, as it often happens around David, turned into politics. And people were asking David for his opinion on which presidential candidate, for the Dems or for the Republicans, did he think had the best chance? And then, David, you said something that was really interesting that got my attention, because you said, look, far more important than where a president is on the ideological spectrum of left, right, or their charisma, or their political or cultural or economic issue. You said the most important issue was whether this candidate has the temperament and the character to lead this nation in war or in a time of potential war. That's it. That was the overriding evaluative criteria that you were applying, and that, as we discussed, that you really felt like everyone, including Christians, should apply. So I want you to explain that more. Why do you think in this upcoming election, ability to lead our nation in war or potential war is the defining trait that everyone, including Christians, should be applying?
Yeah, that's a great question, Curtis. It's something that I've said a few times, and folks are always like, wait, what? You mean the Ukraine war might be the most important thing that we should be thinking about in deciding, or how someone will respond to a Chinese attack on Taiwan? And let me just sort of walk through it this way. One is, and there's a multi-layered answer to this question. One of them is just, let's just be honest about what are the most cataclysmic events of the last 150 years. And if you're going to go back and look at the most cataclysmic events of the last 150 years, two are going to be easy to state: World War I and World War II. We can't even conceive of how cataclysmic those events were, because with the exception of the few veterans of World War II we have left, who are, sadly passing away every day, we don't have a category in our mind for a world torn apart to that degree.
Yeah.
And we have gotten accustomed to a very different world, to a world where the combination of, sort of the mutually assured destruction and deterrence of the Cold War, followed by American supremacy after the end of the Cold War, has meant that our world has been free of great power conflict for multiple generations now. We've been so free of it, we don't have a mental category for what that would be like. And of anything, you think of the policy that is really, really important to you, whether it is tax policy, whether even things like climate change, which is extraordinarily consequential, but any given person isn't going to be able to make a singular decision, even an American president, that's going to be able to alter. That's a cumulative decision-making process across multiple world, across world civilization. But when it comes to the issue of global world conflict, number one, it's hard to think of something that could be more cataclysmic. And number two, it's also hard to think of an issue where the president has more direct immediate control, authority, and power. So this is where there is an enormous concentration of power in the chief executive in our system around foreign policy, around decisions of war and peace. Everything that has happened since World War II has only accumulated more power in the executive. And so it's the combination of the gravity of the issue and the power of the chief executive that has led me to say, of all of the issues that will be presenting the United States in 2024, none is going to be more important than that.
Well, a third element, there's gravity, there's importance, and then there's also immediacy, because the reality is America is engaged in a ongoing massive shooting war right now, not with its direct troops, but it is the main supplier of the largest armed conflict happening in the world right now between two organized large-scale armies. That war is not going on without United States involvement as the arsenal behind Ukraine's defense of its country.
And more than that, we provide intelligence. If you can, there are credible news reports, very, very, very credible news reports that we're providing intelligence to the Ukrainians. So we're supplying Ukrainians, we're propping up the Ukrainian economy, what's left of the Ukrainian economy. We are supplying intelligence to the Ukrainian military, allegedly. We're not involved in the shoot. We're not involved in the shooting part, but if you removed our support from Ukraine, the world would change.
And if you think about how Biden has led the country to support Ukraine versus some of the statements from our former president, Trump, about what he would have done, it's a very stark different scenario we're talking about here. And so that shows, just even in this current war, how consequential presidents are to war. But David, you also brought up in our conversation that in the future, in the next 5 or 10 years, America may be drawn even more directly in a shooting war. So say more about that.
Yeah. So and I'm not as much thinking about Russia and the aftermath of any conflict with Ukraine, because I think for the time being, Russia's offensive military capabilities are being sort of exhausted right now. It's hard to see Russia emerging stronger in the short term. Although I could easily imagine over the longer term, if they defeat Ukraine, which is still possible, if they defeat Ukraine, then they could emerge over the longer term stronger. But we're in a very, very difficult situation now with China and Chinese designs on Taiwan. And the thing that I think that is very important for people to understand is that this is a challenge that in many ways is different from the challenge that we had with the Soviet Union, in the following sense, that the Soviet Union was always a military competitor with us, and at various points in time could be a technological competitor. For example, they were first into space. A lot of their weapon systems were quite capable, but over time that became less true. We became far more technically superior. But we were always an economic powerhouse compared to the Soviet Union. We had a lot of strengths that the Soviet Union, for all of its size and all of its military power, didn't have. Well, China's an absolute economic powerhouse. It is an absolute technological powerhouse. It is a peer competitor with military technology. And it is growing dramatically stronger and much more aggressive. The Chinese Navy is now bigger than our Navy. There are a lot of very, very, very smart people who say that China could actually win a war with us over Taiwan. And then this is something that's super important for people to recognize, is that a failure of deterrence in Taiwan does not necessarily mean that China will invade Taiwan and leave us with the choice of whether to engage in armed conflict or not. But China may decide to take Taiwan by also first attacking us. So, and that's how
sort
high
of the Pearl Harbor
scenario. Deterrence.
Yeah.
The Pearl Harbor scenario. And if you think, oh, that's crazy, David, that's insane, David, think about this. If you are a military planner for the nation of China, and the number one obstacle to you achieving your military aims is the United States Pacific Fleet. That is the number one obstacle. Do you execute an operation that leaves your number one obstacle intact? Or do you execute an operation that takes at least the major assets of your number one obstacle off the board? And then, unlike Japan, which attacked us on December 7th, 1941, enraged America, launched America into World War II, unlike Japan, which had no ability to deter us from mobilizing against Japan, what if you take American forces off the board and then put your new gains that you've achieved under your under your nuclear umbrella?
Yeah.
Then you begin to see why this is so urgent and scary.
Now, I imagine there are listeners out there who are like, don't tell me this. I don't want to hear this. This is making me very uncomfortable and very anxious. Count me as one of those folks. I was born in Taiwan. I have family in Taiwan. I know the Chinese, the mainland Chinese, communist Chinese sentiments towards Taiwan. It is something to be taken very seriously. It is deeply embedded in their national identity. And yet the thought of a shooting war, massive war, I don't want to think about it. And this reminds me of the last podcast I did with Dr. Lydia Dugdale about death. And there we talked about how there are some scenarios where we don't, makes us uncomfortable, makes us anxious, so we don't want to think about it. And death is one of them. But as a result, we end up being unprepared for death. We were prepared for conditions that hit us right around death, medical conditions that come at us fast and furious. And we end up not being prepared to make thoughtful decisions aligned with our values because the issues of the moment are just coming at us so rapidly that we are swept along by the current events rather than by our deep convictions. And I think war at a mass level has the same effect, that war does not give you advance warning usually. War does not give you a lot of time to think. These things can happen very quickly. And just like if you haven't thought about death as an individual beforehand, before death is imminent, if you haven't thought about war before war is imminent, you too are very likely to be swept along and be unprepared for how to think about it, how to respond to it, how to pray about it, how to act in it. And I think Christians are just as they are in danger of being unprepared to think about death at the individual level, at a collective level as a church, we are in danger of being unprepared to think about war. And I have firsthand experience with what happens when Christians and when church leaders, when pastors are unprepared to think about war. I had a very direct experience of this. So back in 2001 was when I first joined the pastoral staff of my church, the River Church community. I was leaving InterVarsity staff, and so I joined the pastoral team as a sort of the newest junior member of the senior leadership team. That was July 2001. A few months later, we have 9/11. And about a month after that, American planes are bombing Afghanistan. American special forces are on the ground in Afghanistan. And it is the thing that everybody is talking about at that time. And so as a pastoral team, we gather together and we are talking about, well, what should we say? How should this affect our Sunday service? And it was striking to me about just how paralyzed and mumbly everybody was. And that's the best way I could describe it, was mumbly. Yeah. It was like, we should say something, we should do something. And it was clear no one on the team had a articulated way of how to think about the church in a time of war. And so the best people could mount was, we should pray for peace. And so I raised the question, okay, that's great, but that's a very mumbly prayer. Like, what kind of peace? Like, peace with the Taliban in power? Peace with the Taliban defeated? And so there was this struggle about what to say. And in particular, and I'll just name this, what happened was people were especially not only mumbly, but conflicted. They were conflicted because just a few months later, the senior pastor had preached a sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount and had preached about Matthew 5:38, which says, I will read the verse, you have heard it. This is Jesus' words, Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:38. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not use violence to resist evil. Now, he had just preached on this a few months ago. How was he supposed to reconcile that sermon with the fact that our country was now
Right.
at war? And so everybody was just mumbling. And if we didn't say anything, it was clear what was going to happen, that we were going to cede the formation of our people's views on this massive political event to secular media, to secular political forces. And half of our church was going to go more left-leaning, Bay Area progressive, and go about like, against war, make love, not war kind of stream of culture. And the other half was going the God bless America and our troops stream. And so basically, if the church said nothing, that was going to happen, which is essentially what is happening, kind of in our church today. But even then, we were seeing the seeds of this. And so what happened was, because none of the senior pastors felt equipped to preach about how to think about the war, it fell to me. Like the guy who had just arrived a few months earlier, I was tasked with preaching on the most important topic in the world to make sense of it for our church. And I'm saying that not to like give myself a claim, but more to illustrate how unprepared the church was. And I think when I look out at the church today, that state of unpreparedness is the norm. It's not the exception. It is the norm. That if we had an equivalent event to 9/11 and to, God forbid, a shooting war over Taiwan, there would be the same paralysis and mumbliness that would prevail over the church today. So, David, what do you think about that? What do you think is the state of preparedness in the church among Christians to make sense of war?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's funny, I have a similar kind of story, but going not a similar story in the sense of walking into church immediately after a major event involving armed conflict, with people have kind of a deer in the headlights look about what do you say about this.
Yes.
And I remember coming in to church after 9/11. It's a very different place. I was in a church in rural Kentucky, and there was no real ambivalence. Like nobody had any angst over how we should respond to this. But I was in a more urban church after Osama bin Laden was killed. So this is like days after Osama bin Laden was killed. And it is the most important story, not just in the United States, but in the world by orders of magnitude. And everyone on the pastorals team had this deer in the headlights look.
Right.
Like, how do you deal with the whole country is essentially celebrating the killing of another human being, right?
Yeah.
And how do you deal with that? And so there's a lot of deer in the headlights when it comes to this kind of topic. And for a lot of understandable reasons, we've had the blessing of not having to think through major great power conflict for a while. But yeah, you're exactly right. And there are very little readily available resources for Christians to think through these issues. And I kind of have an advantage because of my military background, and specifically the area of the things that I did for the military. So I was an Army lawyer, and I was a JAG officer, and one of the absolute elementary aspects of becoming a JAG officer is you're learning not just the legal arguments about war, but you're learning the moral arguments about war, because there would be no law of war in the absence of moral argument about war. And right. So the law of war, which was my job, is rooted in millennia of moral arguments, including arguments deeply influenced by Christianity.
Okay, deeply. So let's get to that, because you're absolutely...
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, you're absolutely right. There's a lack of resources. So David, that's our job today, is we're going to provide a resource, at least our pass at it. We're going to try to help Christians that's our job as Good Faith, is to make sense of the world. And we're going to try to help Christians make sense of a world at war. And David, you just mentioned about how you went to war in Iraq. I want you to draw back, though, for a moment from the kind of high level abstractions of just war theory, for instance. And I want you to talk a little more personally to start out with, because when the war with Iraq broke out, you made the decision to enlist. in that war.
Mm-hmm.
And so you made that decision, I know, because I was with you in that, in a very thoughtful manner. You were prepared to make that decision. You did not allow events to simply sweep you off your feet on this. And so share with listeners how you personally arrived at that decision. What was this, as a Christian, how did you make
Yeah.
sense of this war and the fact that you were a follower of Jesus?
Right. So this is going to be where some listeners will get really mad at me, but and I believed the war in Iraq was a just war. So I believed it met the criteria of a just war. I believe it was the right decision for the United States of America. I have a lot of issues with the way in which the war was conducted. In other words, that we made tactical and strategic mistakes that made the war more difficult and more bloody than it should have been. So I believe that there were mistakes that were definitely made, but I believed in the righteousness of the cause, both as a matter of morality and law, and morality and law were deeply linked here. But then at the same time, I reached a point where I was very convicted that me, as an able-bodied, not yet middle-aged man at that time, still on the older side of young, that is an able-bodied young man, that I wasn't willing to go and deploy to the war myself. So I was urging other peoples to make the sacrifice, and I ultimately couldn't reconcile with my conscience with that I would urge others to make a sacrifice that I wasn't willing to make myself. And so in close consultation with Nancy, it was probably, Curtis, how sometimes your conscience is not just kind of whispering to you, it's screaming at you.
Yeah.
That's how I felt. I felt like my conscience was screaming at me. You used whatever public platform you had, which at that time was like microscopically small, but you used whatever public platform you had to advocate for this. Now the nation's embroiled in it. Americans are dying. Iraqis are dying. And what are you doing? Like, what are you doing? And so
Yeah.
I just felt like my conscience wouldn't let me stay at home any longer.
Now, you mentioned that you felt this was a righteous war and based on this body of theology called just war theory that really is born out of Christian
Yeah.
reasoning and moral reflection on war. Give our listeners kind of the dummies version of just war theory, especially the jus ad bellum part of it,
Yes.
the justice for when you can go to war. We'll get to the how do you engage in war once you are in war in a moment later. But for now, I want you to help listeners, like, how has Christian tradition made sense of the decision to go to war in just war theory?
You're right. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'll give sort of the very short version, because when you're talking about law of war, there's two concepts. There's jus ad bellum and jus in bello. So jus ad bellum is the law of when it is appropriate to wage war, and jus in bello is when, and forgive me, listeners, if I'm butchering pronunciations, but is what it means. How do you wage war? The first is when do you wage war, and the other is how do you wage war. So the when is essentially based on a few basic principles. One, there is a fundamental bedrock that the intentional taking of human life is a grave wrong, as a basic bedrock. But when there is also a responsibility to defend and to protect, a nation itself has a responsibility to defend or protect its own citizens and to defend or protect justice. So the baseline background is taking a human life is wrong. There is a grave wrong. At the same time, you have a duty to defend your own citizens, your own people, from having their lives taken from them. You also have a duty to defend your own citizens from having their most basic rights as human beings taken from them. And so what that then means is that the protection of innocent life and the defense of justice will occasionally and sometimes require the willingness to use force. And so the way in which sort of the international law has dealt with this is for a long time, since World War I, which was so dreadful that people categorized it as the war to end all wars, they hoped it would be, people have been trying to outlaw aggressive war. In other words, to say aggression against another nation, one nation invading another one, is just a flat out violation of international law. So there was an attempt to quite literally outlaw aggressive war. Sadly, it didn't work. So you have the Kellogg-Briand Pact after World War I. You're trying to outlaw aggressive war. Hitler disregards that. Imperial Japan disregards that. In that circumstance, the responsibility to protect, that duty to defend, kicks in. Now, it's very easy to state that when it's your own country that is being invaded. So, this sort of idea that, well, Ukraine has a responsibility to protect or a duty to defend its own citizens is an easy principle to state. But when do you come to the aid of other citizens? When do you come to the aid of other countries? And here, there's a long international recognition of a right of sort of what's called collective self-defense. In other words, you prevent war by saying, if you try to chew up and swallow a smaller country, a bunch of other countries will come to the aid of the smaller country. And the whole design of it is to make aggressive war so difficult as to make it functionally an irrational choice. Then you have, so that's collective self-defense. And then there's this other question of what do you do when a country is sort of genocidal towards its own people and its own citizens? Does just war theory allow for a responsibility to protect in that circumstance? And again, just war theory would say that there is a responsibility to protect. Now, that doesn't mean that you go to war every time somebody does something awful to their own citizens. There's a lot of factors that you have to consider. But there's this entire concept in international law, which is rooted in profound moral values, called a responsibility to protect. And it has, and I'll stop filibustering, it has 3 key pillars. And I'm reading from a piece that I wrote a couple of years ago. First, nations have a responsibility to protect their own citizens from mass atrocities. Second, the international community has a responsibility to assist states in protecting their populations. And third, the international community has a responsibility to protect individuals when a state is manifestly failing to protect its population. And so along those lines, that's how you think about just war. It's a fundamentally protective versus aggressive, if that makes sense.
Okay, that's a great answer. But I want to just give listeners some context to everything that David said. This body of reflection called just war theory, I believe, is actually deeply congruent with Christianity and actually grew out of a lot of, especially Catholic moral reflection, moral teaching on the role of force and the use of state force. The problem, so I get that as an intellectual. As a pastor, I know there's a problem with everything you just said, David, which is it just sounds like abstractions. And as evangelicals who are like, hey, I'm about the Bible. Don't give me this Catholic moral teaching about just war theory and so forth. Right. I'm about the Bible. And so I mean, this would more characterize the people at my church in 2001, right? Who had just heard the Bible taught on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:38. You have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not use violence to resist evil. And so I want to take a moment now to go on my little filibuster to help Christians make sense biblically of this. Because this is, I think, the average person who is like, their eyes and ears kind of glaze over when you're talking about abstractions like just war theory. And this is actually this of how do we make sense of Matthew 5:38, Jesus teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, and how do you reconcile it with war? There's a critical missing piece for why Christians gets kind of turned inside and out by this. And you know what it is, David? What's missing? It's a theology of institutions. That's what's missing in this. All right. It all comes back to that. But I'm very serious here because war is a profoundly institutional activity. That's what war is. It is organized armies by nation states engaging in this institutional activity called war. The problem is, if you don't have a theology of institutions, you read everything in Scripture and all of Jesus' teaching then in a collapsed way that collapses everything down to the individual level. So you approach all of Jesus' teaching as if it was a universal ethic for individuals to practice. And so if you read and listen to Sermon on the Mount that way, then it's really hard to make sense of war, because it says, Jesus is pretty clear, right? Do not use violence to resist evil. If that is like universally applicable to all individuals, how do you reconcile that with war? And this is where we need a way of thinking about institutions, because actually the Sermon on the Mount has to be understood through an institutional lens. Why do I say this? Because that's how Matthew sets it up. Matthew is setting up the whole proclamation of Jesus in those first chapters as Jesus is doing what you might call a massive reorg. He's doing a massive reorg of the nation of Israel. The Jesus narrative is taught that way. This is why Jesus's family goes into Egypt and then leaves Egypt. He's re-articulating, re-narrating the story of Israel writ large through Jesus himself. That's why following that, Jesus goes into the wilderness to face his temptation, because that re-encapsulates, retells the story of Israel that went into the wilderness. And now Jesus is on a mountain giving moral instruction, giving moral laws. What is that a re-encapsulation of? It's Moses on Mount Sinai giving the 10 Commandments that were to be the institutional laws governing the nation of Israel. So Jesus here is doing the work of saying, I'm going to reorganize this institution called Israel in a radical way around me. And I need to do that because Israel was originally meant institutional. Its mission as an institution in the world was to be a light for the nations. But it's lost that light. That's the whole point of Sermon on the Mount, that light has gone out, that light has been hidden under a bushel. And so what Israel was meant to be was to be a different kind of nation, a light to the nation that was to cast light on God's kingdom, on God's coming kingdom. That was Israel's special institutional mission, was to live and act in the world in a way that shed light, that pointed to the distinctive special reality of God's kingdom in this world. But the problem is Israel's lost that. So Jesus is trying to, and one of the ways that Israel has lost that in the time of Jesus' ministry was it had succumbed to basic petty power politics, just like every other nation in the world. It was engaged in the same political calculus, military calculus, and was not taking its cues from the fact that it was God's special nation to be a light for the nations. And so Jesus is reorganizing, and that's why you see all of the Sermon on the Mount is saying, you've heard it said this, and he's referring to the original Judaic law. You've heard it this way, but I'm saying this. This is the formula of the Sermon on the Mount, because he's reorganizing Israel around himself and saying, this is how you, this new reorganized Israel, which will be his church, will be the church, will ultimately be the Christian church, are to engage in the world in a different way from the other nations. And this is why this ethic of nonviolent resistance to evil actually is important. It is important, but it's important for the institutional mission of the church. This is the church's mission in the world, is to point to the way of a God's response to evil, which ultimately is found in the cross, which is this nonviolent kind of endurance, exhaustion of evil through love. It's a different mode of resisting evil than the way the world's nations do. It is God's kingdom way of doing that. And so the church, the new Israel, their institutional mission is to model, to point to be a light to the cross, which is the response to evil with love, not with further violence that defeats in an existential way, in a deep way, exhausts, absorbs the power of evil by love, outendures evil through the cross, and points to the ultimate fulfillment of the kingdom that is to come. Because again, the way the Christians have to think about time is the cross inaugurated the kingdom of God. The final implementation of the kingdom of God is still to come. And we see the vision of how war is to be exhausted, defeated, extinguished in the final second coming of Jesus, when the kingdom will be fully completed, in verses like Isaiah 2:4, where it says, he, the king, which will be Jesus, shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and nations shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So the church's institutional mission is to point to model that the reality that began, that was inaugurated with the cross's defeat of evil through nonviolence, and the final implementation of that reality when Jesus returns to fully complete the kingdom. But here is the key thing. First of all, that hasn't happened yet. So we live in the now and not yet. That's the first thing. So we still live with war and evil. And secondly, that commandment, that is a special mission for the church. So this is why I absolutely believe the church is to practice nonviolent resistance. And every time the church has taken up military arms in the cause of the church's aims, it has gotten off track, right? And so this is where the church absolutely should be committed as a church, as an institution, to nonviolent resistance to military. But the church is not the only institution ordained by God in the world, especially this world that is the now and not yet. There's other institutions. There are secular institutions that have a different, related but different institutional mission. And one of those is the state and its military. And this is why we need to distinguish the church and the state, because they have different purposes ordained by God. And we cannot, and this is why we don't want these two to be conflated. We don't want a theocracy, because the state actually has a different set of aims and purposes ordained by God. And that does involve the military. So David, I want to turn it back to you. I want to end my filibuster, my theological filibuster. And I want you to explain what is in the biblical vision, what is God's purpose for the now, for the current now, but not yet. What is God's purpose for the state, and in particular the state's military forces?
Yeah, that's another really good question. And, you're going back to Romans, which Paul in Romans specifically speaks to the role that the state has in bearing the sword, that it's an agent of wrath for the wrongdoer. And I think this is something that's really important to understand within the concept of and where does Christian just war theory come from biblically? And so you're talking about an explicit role for the state in bearing the sword. And I want to be clear when we talk about this. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Christian pacifists, those who believe that the state should not engage in war and that Christians should not engage in war. I have a lot of respect for that. I disagree with it, but I have a lot of respect for it. And that there is actually a role for the state as an agent of wrath against the wrongdoer. Okay. And the key there is not sword. It's not wrath. It's wrongdoer. Okay.
Right.
And this is where that just war theory comes in. It's not that you just sort of mindlessly say, okay, well, the state bears the sword, right? The state bears the sword. That's what it does. There is a purpose. And when it is not bearing it for that purpose, it is not bearing it righteously.
Let me just read.
Yeah, go please.
Okay, let me just read Romans 13, 1-5, just because this is what David's talking about. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. These are the secular authorities of the state. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he, the state bearing the sword, does not bear the sword in vain. He is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's judgment on the wrongdoer. So just to reiterate, the state here is being given a God-given purpose, different than the church, that is for the here and now, where there is still evil ruling. And so one way to think about this, the difference is, in this here of now and not yet, there are evildoers who raise the sword. The state's job is to wield the sword to block that sword, right? To block the sword against that sword coming down on the innocent. The church's role is to point to a different way, where the sword gets turned into the plowshare. But those are different institutions with different institutional purposes. But the key thing is this state given purpose of bearing the sword to block the evil sword. That is its God's given purposes. And the church actually has a role to hold the state accountable to that God-given purpose. Because the point of Romans 13 is not, well, fine, whatever the state does, just let that I guess we go along. God bless USA, whatever it does. No, the point is the church has to actually hold the state accountable to do this work well, to do it in its God-given purpose. And so it has a voice to say, wait a minute, are you bearing that sword to actually block the evildoer? Are you bearing that sword for the limited purposes that God has ordained for it? Or have you overstepped your bounds? Have you taken the sword for your own glory state? Or have you taken the sword to execute your own evil? That the church's role is to play that prophetic role of holding the state accountable to this both limited in scope, that it's just to block evil. It can't do anything more than to block evil, and time delimited. It is for this moment here and now, and it ultimately will give way when Jesus returns to usher in the final kingdom, where swords get turned into plowshares.
That's thank you for that, Curtis, because that, I think it really does articulate. There's the biblical statement, and then what just war theory does, and to sort of think through just war theory, is it's the church's accountability for the state, because what it's saying is, how do we know what's the wrongdoing that is sufficient that is so severe that force is not just justifiable but necessary? Because wrongdoing is a big term, right? Wrongdoing is a big term. There's a lot of wrongdoing that pulling the sword out for when it does not capture the intent of that passage, and
it is not commensurate, to use the just war theory category, right?
Exactly. And this is a super short way of stating it. I love this. This is from Joseph LeConte, who's a former scholar at the Heritage Foundation, and he wrote that the motive for armed intervention must be to prevent human suffering. That's the right intention. Means short of force must be judged as unlikely to stop the aggressor, last resort. The military option must be proportional to the threat. That's a concept called proportionality. And the consequences of the action must not be worse than inaction, reasonable prospects. That's classic, as he says, that's classic Christian just war theory. What is the level of wrongdoing, and what is the level of force that is necessary to address the wrongdoing, not to compound or return evil for evil, if that makes sense?
Yes. All right, David, we're going to take a quick break now because we've thrown a lot of stuff at our listeners. David, on this break, I want to ask you a question. We've been having a lot of fun talking about these big topics, but what's an even more fun format in which we engage our conversations in?
Oh, I love the Ask Us Anything format, where we're responding directly to those folks who have real and very tough questions for us, because they not only are fun to, it's not only fun to hear from listeners, it's a lot of fun, I think, for us, Curtis, to wrestle through their questions.
We love it. These are lit conversations when we take questions. And if you're listening to this and you like the idea of participating or at least listening in to a live Ask Me Anything episode, you have the opportunity to do that. March 28th, David and I are going to do a live Ask Me Anything on Zoom. But here's the key. You have to become a member of Redeeming Babel to have access both to the live Ask Me Anything and the recording of it if you can't make that. So you have to go to redeemingbabel.org and just take 10 seconds. That's all it takes. 10 seconds to sign up to be a member, and then you will get access to the Ask Me Anything that David and I do, as well as a number of other benefits, discounts to courses, our newsletter, and so forth. So go hit pause right now. If you haven't done so yet, hit pause, go to redeemingbabel.org, sign up as a member. David and I will wait for you. And then that will give you access to all of this extra content, including our Ask Me Anything episode with David. So that's all you need to do. Now, keep in mind, if you are listening to this podcast and you've been a subscriber to this podcast just through Apple Podcasts or Spotify or something like that, that does not mean you are a member of Redeeming Babel. You have to take the extra step, which only takes 10 seconds, to go sign up as a member. Okay, end of plug. Let's go back to our discussion about war. Okay, so David, I think we've established at least a theologically robust, not everybody may agree with it, but at least a theologically robust case for why the state can go to war if it is executing its God-given purpose to be the sword that blocks against the sword of the evildoer in Romans 13, 1-5, and then further articulated and specified in Christian just war theory. Okay, but then it still raises this pastoral question, which is, okay, the state maybe can go to the war. And again, we've established this is a institution. This is why we need to think institutionally. This is a mission and purpose for the institution of the secular state and its armed forces. It is not the purpose of the church. Separate institution, different institutional purpose. However, there's this tricky pastoral question. What then about the individual Christian who may want to feel called to serve in the secular state-run armed forces? How do we make sense of that? What is the way in which Christians ought to think about their possible calling as individuals in a different institution, in a secular institution, and how do they go about that? So, David, what are your thoughts about that question?
Yeah, that's a really good question. First, biblically, if you're going to look back, biblically, there is precedent for Roman centurions. In other words, people who are leaders in the Roman military, both becoming Christian and remaining centurions when they are Christian, remaining Roman soldiers when they are Christian. And so you have biblical precedent for people who have been called to follow Jesus, who then remain in their station, remain as soldiers. So the sort of idea that if you are a Christian, you cannot carry the sword at all, that there is a flat barrier against carrying the sword, I think is just, I don't see the biblical example for that. I don't see that as the biblical example. But, Curtis, there's a big but here. Once you do grab the sword that the state gives you when you put on the uniform, you are not a mindless automaton of the state. Okay, so for example, and we put this actually into American law here. There is such a thing as an unlawful order in American military law. There is such a thing as a duty to disobey an unlawful order. So if you're ordered, say, to massacre civilians, you have a legal duty to disobey that, because again, if you're talking now, morality and law are not identical. Like what's moral is not legal and what's immoral is not illegal. That's not a perfect set overlap. But the law of war, both the law of jus ad bellum and jus in bello, are based in morality, and there is the moral command, the moral obligation not to become an instrument of wrongdoing when you are bearing the sword for the state is greater than your obligation to the state. And I think that's something that's very, very important to state. One of the most powerful movies I've ever seen in my life is A Hidden Life, a Terrence Malick movie about a Austrian man who refused service in the Wehrmacht to the German army in World War II. And here was the state telling him to bear the sword, and he said no, and he was executed for it. So
once again, we're giving love to Hidden Life here on Good Faith.
Yes. So you can be a member of the military and be a Christian. Absolutely. But there are moral obligations that come with that at the same time.
I love that framework. And just to give a biblical example, specific biblical example, I think a great example is in Luke chapter 3, verse 12-14, when John the Baptist is preaching about the kingdom of God and preaching repentance, saying you must repent to enter the kingdom of God. So what happens? Well, tax collectors also, I'm reading straight from verse 12, tax collectors also came to be baptized and said to him, Teacher, what shall we do? And he said to them, collect no more than you are authorized to do. Soldiers also asked him, verse 14, and we, what shall we do? And he said to them, do not extort money from anyone by threats or by false accusation, and be content with your wages. Now, the principle being enacted there is exactly, David, what you just said, is yes, John the Baptist could have easily, when the soldiers come to him, easily said, well, leave the army. That's what you need to do in order to enter the kingdom of God. He doesn't say that. He says, what you need to do is carry out your duty within the right moral construct, within the right moral framework, and do not overstep those purposes by which God has ordained your duties. And so don't extort money, because you're incurring evil. You're overstepping your use of the sword for your own self gain, not to protect the innocent from the evil. So don't do that, and be content with your wages. In other words, be content the way this has been set up. Don't overstep. And again, I think that's a great sort of biblical framework, a biblical sort of principle for what you're talking about, that the Christian's role in the military is to be that voice that's saying, hey, we can only do what we are authorized to do. We cannot overstep these bounds. We must be content with the purposes that we have been assigned to. And David, you have like real life experience sort of playing that role as a JAG officer of keeping the military within its authorized parameters, within such that it does not do more than it's supposed to do.
Right. And I'm not, and let me just say for a minute, I'm not going to say, I would never say that the American soldier or the American military gets this right all the time. There are bad people in the U.S. military, like there are bad people in every institution. But I will say this: the moral instincts that have been inculcated into the U.S. military are very sound. Sort of the ethos of what it means to be a U.S. soldier, how you are inculcated into the U.S. military, how you are taught the law of armed conflict, and it has created a set of moral instincts that I witnessed with my own eyes, where there were moments, Curtis, where our guys would not pull the trigger, even when legally they could. Even when the law of armed conflict, which sets the sort of minimal baseline floor of conduct, even though the law of armed conflict said you have the ability to pull the trigger, they would not pull the trigger, because in the difficulty of the moment or the horror of the moment, they knew that even though pulling the trigger was lawful, they couldn't live with themselves if they did, and so. There are situations, so the moral instincts in that I experienced firsthand are very strong. But at the same time, one of my roles was to reinforce those doctrines and reinforce those instincts. So that was part of my job. And it's a very interesting thing, because a lot of people look at the job that I have and say, what the heck are lawyers doing deployed with combat arms units? Get the lawyers out of the way. And I don't want to overemphasize how much I was in the way, because I was not really in the way very much at all. But there was still a role to reinforce, in the heat of everything, to reinforce those those legal obligations and those moral instincts. And that's what I tried to do to the best of my ability.
Okay, let's bring this back to the fact that we said this need for Christians to prepare for war, to prepare to think biblically, thoughtfully about war, and not get swept along the current of events, was something that is necessary now, because we are engaged, we're at least involved in a shooting war, not directly, but we are the direct supplier and supporter of it. And we may be engaged, who knows, in the future, as awful as that scenario sounds. So let's start with the first scenario with Ukraine, with this current situation. Let's try to synthesize everything we've said. How can the church more faithfully play its role? How can the church institutionally, and how can individual Christians individually faithfully play its role in both the institutional and individual dimensions in the current conflict in Ukraine?
So I have a two-part answer to this, one that should be not controversial and one that is.
Okay.
So the not controversial one is we have a huge role to play in humanitarian assistance. There is, no matter where you stand on the point of view of providing arms, no matter where you stand on the point of view of taking up arms, the obligation to help the people who've been wounded, displaced, immiserated, traumatized, we have a huge role to play there. Huge. And it has been wonderful to see many Christian institutions, from small congregations in rural Alabama to big Christian organizations like Samaritan's Purse, have poured resources into easing human suffering. So that's one. I also think, and this is the one that's more controversial, there is a role for us to play in fortifying our leaders and fortifying the people of Ukraine, sometimes quite literally with weapons, to resist this evil aggression, to not just ameliorate the suffering, but to defeat the aggression itself. And I think that is one of our fundamental, and I believe it's a moral obligation to try to defeat this aggression.
Completely agree. I'm going to call that non-controversial. I mean, I know some people will agree, but I believe that the case is very clear. This is a case where evil is wreaking havoc and destruction, and the state's role, the secular state's role, is to raise the sword in defense of that, of the innocent, and to block the evil sword. And we ought to be equipping the people of Ukraine with more swords, with better swords, with precision-guided swords, if possible. And so,
right,
I absolutely believe that we, especially as you see some of the signs of eroding support of, Americans are notorious for not having a lot of endurance in our moral commitments to causes. And so as Christians, we need to be, I think, lending our voice to defeat evil, which is not the ultimate defeat of evil, but it is for this now and not yet, it is the defeat, or the restraint, I should say, not the defeat, but the restraint of evil. Let's think then about, apart from Ukraine, for some future conflict, like, say, tensions are rising in the Taiwan Straits. How should Christians be interpreting that possible scenario emerging, how both as individuals but also as a church? What is the role then for individual Christians and the church in a brewing conflict that may draw the United States even more directly in?
Yeah, this is another really good question. And I think we should place an absolute priority on deterrence, that we are in a mode where we have to try to prevent this. So that we are not placed in the horrific circumstance of having to respond to the awful humanitarian disaster that we have in Ukraine, or that the act of repelling the aggression itself is going to lead to just unimaginable suffering just in the course of war itself. And I'm actually was quite impressed with an exchange that I listened to on another podcast, not to say that there are any other podcasts worth listening to, but after you have listen to our podcast here, there's a really good podcast if you're a military history buff, if you're a foreign policy nerd, called School of War. Very good podcast. And Aaron McLean, the host of it, was interviewing now this is a job, Curtis. How about this is a job? A former captain of one of the British Trident nuclear submarines. And so for those of you who don't know what a Trident submarine is, it is a submarine that it is a nuclear submarine that can launch the Trident missile. The Trident missile is a nuclear armed missile developed during the Cold War. That's one of the most powerful and deadly weapons ever created by the mind of man. It is one of the most destructive weapons that mankind can wield. And Aaron asked him, what was your moral justification for the idea that you might have to turn that key to launch the deadliest weapons mankind has ever designed? And he said, this is my mission. And what I looked at every day of my mission my mission was to go one more tour of duty, one more trip through the ocean without great power conflict. That was my mission. My mission was to stop, to prevent, to keep the peace. And he looked at his mission as fundamentally humanitarian, as the very existence of his mission maintained peace. And that's one way I think of deterrence. When I think of deterrence, I think that is fundamentally a mission of peace. That is its fundamental purpose. And so that's why I think when I'm thinking about the situation with Taiwan, is how one of our absolute priorities as a people is to maintain peace. And that does not mean by capitulating to China and throwing 20 some odd million people into totalitarian injustice. How do you maintain justice and maintain peace? And that is by deterrence.
Which I believe then should enter our calculations as a people, as Christians and as citizens about the president that we will be electing next year. So to bring the topic back full circle to our beginning, I really agree with everything you've just said, which means we need a president that is going to soberly lead our country along a path of cautious but still strong deterrence against evil, including the evil of Russia and the evil of China. And this should enter our decision-making process. We ought to be evaluating because there's a moral imperative here. We ought to be evaluating with a moral imperative. Is this the president that can actually lead this country along that path? And I think in some ways, more than this person is going to be agreeable to be on this cultural or social issue. I think this larger issue of will this president be able to maintain a just peace through deterrence ought to be right up there on the top of our list of how we think about who we are electing into that office. So,
can I add one thing real fast?
Yeah, go for it.
Just real fast, because I know we're running a little bit long. I understand there might be people who are saying, well, okay, I got it, David, but why does it fall to us? This is not a conversation they're having when the next Canadian prime minister is being selected, or the next Mexican president, or they're not sitting here and saying, well, what's Canada going to do? Right. Why is it on us? Why is it on us? And that's a very fair question, but one of the bottom line answers is because we have the capability. Because we have the capability. We have the capability to stop this. When you talk about the horror of the Holocaust, and the world said never again, right, to the Holocaust, and then we went ahead and have seen several genocides since, so we couldn't keep the promise of never again. But when we said never again, there has to be some ability to make good on that promise. And those nations who have that ability, and it's not just us, I mean, Britain, France, Japan, South Korea, these are all countries that have enormous capabilities on their own. But if you have that capability to keep the never again process, then the burden is going to fall on you in a way that it's not going to fall on the societies that don't have the capability.
Luke 12:48, to whom much is given, much will be required. So if you're an American citizen who believes America has been blessed and given tremendous resources and power, and it has, along with that great blessing from God comes responsibility, to go Spider-Man here for a moment. And, too much has been given, much will be required. We have been given much as a nation. That is incumbent upon us to not simply expend all of those resources simply on our own well-being. We have a moral responsibility to use those resources for others, including other nations. And I think that is completely consistent, I think, with the Christian ethic here, that we have to bear an unequal load because we have been unequally blessed relative to other nations when it comes to keeping the peace. All right, David, this has been a great conversation. Listeners, if you loved this conversation, there's more available for you extra content, including this Ask Me Anything that David and I are going to do at the end of March. But again, you have to be a member of Redeeming Babel to get access. You'll get a special code to have access to that live podcast. And also you'll get to submit your questions to us. And in fact, if you're listening now and you want to submit a question to us that you want to hear, hey, how would David and Curtis answer that question? Go become a member and then go to this podcast, this episode, and post in the listen and comment section. You can post in the comment section, just here's a question for you guys. That's how we'll take questions from you to prepare for that Ask Me Anything episode. But again, you have to become a member, then go to this episode and post a question in the comment section for David and me, and we will consider it for our upcoming episode. So thank you, everybody, for being part of this conversation. And once again, next week, join us as we will gather around the campfire.